Om Parthaya Pradibodhidam Bhagavada Narayanena Swayam Vyasena Gratidam Purana Munina Madhye Mahabharatam Advaidam Rudavarshinim Bhagavadim Ashtadashadhyayinim Ambatva Manusandadhami Bhagavad Gita Bhavadveshinim Yam Brahma Varunendra Rudra Marudastunnandu Divyaistavaihi Vedai Sangapadakramopanisadai Gayandiyam Samagaha Dhyanavasthita Tadgatena Manasa Pashyandiyam Yogino Yasyandam Navidusura Suraganaha Devaya Tasmai Namaha. Today we are discussing the 16th sloka, the 16th verse of the 6th chapter of the Bhagavad Gita, Dhyana Yoga. Some of these verses from 16th onwards are very important from the standpoint of practical spiritual life. In fact, Lord Krishna clears many of our common misunderstandings as to how we must practice our disciplines like fasting, vows, meditation, prayers. All these important principles are clearly implied here, expounded here. So the first principle that is expounded here is the ideal of moderation, temperance, self-control or self-restraint, not exceeding limits. In short, practicing moderation in whatever we do, not only in meditation or repeating the holy names, but also in prayer, in eating food, in working, in relaxation, how we must conduct ourselves. All these important principles are laid out here. That is the 16th verse. Na atyasnatas tu yogosti na cha ekantam anasnataha na adisupna shilasya jagrido naiva charjuna. It is the first of these slokas dealing with the practical spiritual life. Normally when we read in books or when we listen to these instructions, lectures, that we must pray, we must meditate, frequently we are not often taught how to actually practice this in our daily life. Some people will think, well, it will come of its own, we don't have to make much effort. And then there are some people who are very active, very rajasic, very dynamic. They think that if they can practice long hours of meditation or prayers or fasting or over asceticism, they can quickly reach the goal. Some people want to keep pandering their senses. Some people want to be cruel, atrocious towards the senses. So extreme life-negating asceticism and an extreme kind of pandering to the needs, demands of the senses. These are two sides of the same coin. That's why Lord Krishna says, yoga or success in yoga, spiritual progress is not for him or her who eats too much. It's a language of metaphor. Eating doesn't mean just eating food only. It means we eat ideas. We eat or we absorb ideas. That is some kind of an eating. We swallow ideas. We grasp and understand things. So any kind of sensory activity is implied here, including the actions involving the senses of action, like the hands, feet, all the different senses of action, and also the senses of perception. The senses of perception means the eyes, the ears, the sense of touch, the sense of smell, the sense of sight, which is the eyes, sense of hearing, which is ears, and so on. So, how we conduct ourselves in this world, how we make use of our senses of perception, jnanendriyani, and senses of action, karmendriyani, with mind. This should be done with moderation, with temperance, with self-restraint. That is the implication. Not only that, even activities involving biologically necessary things like eating food and so on, sleeping, keeping awake, social and moral activities, talking, vows, fasting, all these should be done with one principle in mind. It should be temperate, it should be moderate, it should be properly oriented. That's why Lord Krishna says, atyasnataha, the one who eats too much, the one who indulges in too many activities. Oh, you keep reading all kinds of books on spirituality, one after another, with a great enthusiasm. Then you meditate for long hours at night. Then you pray, engage in prayers for long hours, thinking that if I do more, I can reach the goal faster. This principle doesn't apply in spiritual life, because in spiritual life, we are playing with our mind. And playing with our mind should be done with extreme caution. Maybe it requires much more precaution than engaging in physical activities, because there are remedies for problems coming out of over-exertion at the physical level. But there are very few remedies for over-exertion at the mental level, because mind gets hurt. One classic example frequently mentioned is the practice of dhyana or meditation of dharana or pranayama. So if you long hours of pranayama without any proper restraint of self-control, that the word ati is used, means in excess. That can lead to asthmatic problems, it can lead to delusions of grandeur, it can lead to unsettling the thought process. All these can happen. That's why Lord Krishna says, na atyasnataha yogaha. Yogaha is not possible for somebody who exerts himself or herself too much. So the word used is atyasnataha, means the one who eats a lot. So just as a metaphor, an example is taken from our normal human life. If you eat a lot, you will have indigestion, you will have very serious health problems. So that's why, in fact, Shankaracharya explains some of these expressions, Sanskrit expressions, in his own graphic language. So that's why na tyasnadastu yogosti nacha ekantam anasnataha. So, and yoga is not possible who never eats anything, who doesn't eat at all, who doesn't do anything. In the name of asceticism, a person who doesn't eat food at all, extreme ascetic practices and extreme indulgence are equally harmful and can hurt the mind, because in spiritual life we are trying to purify the samskaras within our own mind, and that should be done with extreme caution. And then na atisukta shilasya, the one who sleeps a lot, it can create dumbness of our activities, it can make us lazy, mentally inactive. So yoga is not possible. Spiritual life, that is the general implication of the word yoga here. Spiritual life is very difficult for those who eat a lot and who is always fasting, and those who is always active and those who are not active at all. Adhisopna Shila is always sleeping, and those who never sleeps at all. So both are extreme points. But somebody may ask this question, then what about certain people, certain spiritually exalted people who do extreme practices, who practice extreme asceticism? We should remember they may have already reached a level of mind control either in their early part of the spiritual life, or maybe according to yoga and Vedanta or Buddha tradition, according to these traditions who believe in the doctrine of reincarnation and doctrine of law of karma, they must have already attained a very high level of self-control by practicing spirituality and spiritual disciplines in their previous life, and after acquiring that level of self-control, if they practice asceticism, it may not do much harm to them. But for the beginners, it is very harmful to practice anything in excess. So Shankaracharya gives an interesting description. He says, Yeduhava atmasammadim annam tat avati tadna hinasti. That means those who eat food that is necessary for their sustenance, for them the food doesn't do any harm, the food protects the body. So the purpose in spiritual life is to go beyond, to transcend the physical level, the sensory level. For that, if a beginner, especially a beginner in spiritual life, if he practice extreme asceticism, then the body may become weak, and a weak body will bring the mind to its level, the physical level. So mind will be always at the physical level if a beginner practices extreme asceticism, centering around external physical disciplines. That the mind will be always brought down to physical level because you are not evolved enough. That's why Shankaracharya says, Yeduha va atmasamadhi annam tat avati. When you eat food that is just enough for the body to sustain, so that your body will not complain, your body will not stand in your path as an obstacle in your spiritual life. The body should not drag the mind to its level, so that we should be able to give enough food to the body that the body doesn't complain at all. So that food, it protects the body and mind. And then yad bhuyo hinasti tad yad kaniyo na tat avati. And suppose you don't eat at all, what happens? Then what happens is that little food, insufficient food, that means extreme asceticism, it does harm to the body, it doesn't protect the body. So this is the view of Shankaracharya. From the simple common sense point of view, what it means is we should practice moderation. So there is a general rule, of course, in spiritual life, that is, one should be stern with oneself and be generous and liberal towards others. This is a common statement in spiritual life. But this doesn't apply in this particular context. It applies in another context. We should be considerate when we consider the needs and demands and requirements of others. We should be generous. But we should not indulge in our own needs and our own enjoyments. So we should be stern with ourselves in self-denial. That is self-discipline. But that should be done with moderation. So that is an important point, remember. Because if we practice over-asceticism, like not eating food at all, or like engaging in long spiritual practices, intense spiritual practices, especially at the beginning, then what happens? It creates a lot of strain. We feel the effort. If we meditate and if we feel a lot of strain after meditation, if you become tired of meditation, if you become exhausted by meditation, if you become exhausted and tired by prayers, then you are not really praying. Spiritual discipline should bring us a feeling of inner blissfulness, inner contentment. It is not satisfaction or happiness as we understand in empirical terms. It is something much more profound and much more spiritually elevating. Any spiritual practice, by doing japa, taking the holy name, it should create in our mind a feeling of joy, pleasantness, inner blissfulness. It is a kind of transcendental spiritual blessedness. And for that we need to practice for a long time. And we should practice without any break. So Patanjali says, Dirghakala Nairandarya Satkara Asevido Dridhabhumi. It should be done for a long time, Dirghakala. Nairandarya means without a break, in constant succession. And Satkara, you should have a sense of respect and reverence towards what you are practicing. That creates Shraddha, and that helps us to sustain the practice for a long time without a break and without feeling the strain and without feeling any effort. So it becomes a natural, spontaneous, effortless, blissful practice. This will help us in facing obstacles that we may have to encounter in spiritual life. Obstacles from outside and obstacles from our own mind. We'll be able to face those obstacles without any bitterness, without any anger, without any disappointment. So that is a spiritual psychology that Lord Krishna unfolds in these coming verses. As I mentioned, the purpose of every spiritual discipline, whether you are praying, whether you are meditating, you are taking the holy name, or whether you are associating with spiritual persons, is to go beyond the body, not fighting with the body, nor pampering the body, but going beyond the body, beyond the physical, so to speak. That's better expression. Going beyond the physical, beyond the sensory level. And you can go beyond the sensory level, you can transcend the sensory level, which is a purpose, which is a goal in spiritual life. You can do that only when you don't fight with your body. At the same time, you don't pamper the body, you don't listen to every demands that come from the body. So there you have to practice sternness towards ourselves. So that's why over-asceticism, life-negating ascetic practices for the beginner will be disastrous. In other words, excess will be always problematic. First, we won't be able to sustain our spiritual practice because we feel a lot of strain, because we are not ready for it. In fact, a person who enforces spiritual disciplines and ascetic practices on himself or herself before being ready for it, what happens? It creates a kind of inner bitterness, not inner blissfulness. I remember long back, there was a person who was very particular about practicing fasting. I said, wow, for every important holy celebration, holy occasion. But he was always bitter because others were not practicing as he was doing, like fasting, taking long vows. So he spent most of the time in finding fault with others whom he thought were not very sincere in their practice of fasting. But that's not the purpose. Fasting should take us closer to God. So upavasa means upasamipi, upasanidhi. You are going towards, you are closer to God. That's the purpose of upavasa or fasting. So one should be ready for ascetic practices, and this readiness, this preparation is possible only through gradual process, the gradual process, means one should associate with spiritual persons, one should read holy scriptures, one should develop an interest in spiritual ideas, thereby our samskaras themselves get purified and elevated. Then what happens, such a person will be able to practice extreme disciplines. At the same time, he won't feel any effort. He won't feel any strain. It will be a blissful experience. Can anyone practice fasting and feel inner blissfulness? That person is ready and fit for practicing fasting without any feeling of strain or effort or bitterness. Otherwise, what happens, we will be unconsciously dragging ourselves closer to the physical level instead of going beyond, instead of transcending the physical level. So that is an important principle that Lord Krishna is implying here. The second problem of extremism in spiritual disciplines, extreme spiritual ascetic practices, is if a person is not ready for it, then after long hours of meditation or practices, he may feel a need to let up the stream. So you have seen people who attend prayers and meditation for a long time, immediately they feel a need to go to a TV, watch a movie, because they feel the need to let up the steam. Sometimes this happens in some other aesthetic arts and practices also, those who reach a very high level of ecstasy in music, art, etc. They suddenly feel a need to let off the steam because they want to forget, they want to avoid, they want to escape from the strain and effort. So that's why Lord Krishna emphasizes this point, moderation. Natyasnadastu yogosti nachayavandam anasnataha. That's why Lord Krishna says. So, nacha adiswapna shilasya. So, extreme steadfastness in sleeping and remaining awake. In both, we should be able to practice moderation and self-restraint. This idea was emphasized and stressed again and again by Gautama Buddha, because he himself realized the importance of this Madhyapantha, the moderation in everything. That's why Lord Krishna says extreme ascetic practices or forced asceticism, self-enforced ascetic practices can be problematic. The reason that some other Tikakaras, Sanskrit exponents, they mention is spiritual disciplines involve this delicate process of elevating and purifying our inherent tendencies and impressions, which we call samskaras, vrittis, vasanas, samskaras, sankalpas, which in general we could say our inherent tendencies, impressions, attitudes, emotions and feelings. They should be elevated, purified and sublimated. That's one important purpose of all spiritual disciplines. At the beginning, the easiest way to begin this process of purification of our impressions is to have association with spiritual persons, either by discussion, by meeting them, or by reading scriptures, or taking an interest, at least an intellectual interest in spiritual literature, because that will give our mind a new focus to concentrate upon. And that will gradually take the mind away from the physical level and will help us to practice spiritual disciplines without any strain. So Lord Krishna continues this idea again in the coming verses. He says, Yukta ahara vikarasya, Yukta cheshtasya karmasu, Yukta sukna avabodhasya, yogo bhavadi dukkhaha. So yoga is called in this verse as the destroyer of all problems, miseries. It is a solution, a permanent solution to all problems. So, yoga becomes a solution to all problems. It's a destroyer of all miseries. To that person who is moderate, temperate, self-restrained, and steadfast in eating, in recreation, in his work, effort for work, and also in his sleep and in his wakefulness. This is the literal translation, more or less. What does it mean? Yoga becomes a solution, a destroyer of misery, dukkha. Dukkham haraditi dukkha means dukkha that it solves all problems of mind and spirit. When we practice these disciplines with moderation, this is an important point. Now, this has a great relevance in the context of Patanjali Yoga Sutra. We should remember, Gita was written, Bhagavad Gita was written almost more than 2,500 years before Patanjali Yoga Sutras. So, Patanjali must have taken many of his ideas from Bhagavad Gita. So, in the Patanjali Yoga Sutra, human mind is analyzed threadbare, and especially Vyasa in his commentary gives a very exhaustive exposition of Patanjali Yoga Sutra. So, of course, we should remember we are indebted to Vyasa for a clear exposition, for the first and most profound exposition of Patanjali Yoga Sutras. So, Vyasa analyzes human mind, and he classifies the human mind into 5 categories. Kshiptam, Mudham, Vikshiptam, Ekagram, Niruddham. Depending upon the way mind functions, the way the vrittis of the mind operate. Vyasa says, of course, Vyasa is commentary, says Vyasa Bhashyam of Patanjali Yoga Sutta. Kshiptam stage is a person whose mind is always restless. It is dull, it cannot grasp anything, it is always restless. But it is also extremely steeped in dullness. Mudha state, it is dull, but it is not restless, it is not capable of grasping anything. Vikshipta state, the third state of human mind, that is common for many spiritual seekers, especially the beginners. Sometimes we feel great joy, great enthusiasm when we practice meditation or prayer, or when we practice karma yoga, or when we listen to some devotional music, or when we take part in some kind of spiritual activity. We feel a great joy. It's fine, wonderful. But then after some time, the mind changes its mood. We lose interest. Next day, when we come back to the place of worship, or when we read the scriptures again, when we listen to the lectures again, the old enthusiasm returns, but it doesn't remain for long, and again mind goes back to a state of dullness or disinterest. So it's like the pendulum of a clock which moves from one extreme angle to another extreme point. It doesn't remain steady. It also always moving from one end to the other end. That's how the normal human mind functions, especially those who strive to enter spiritual life. We are not able to sustain our interests. Now, if such persons, if they suddenly over-exert themselves, when they have a great enthusiasm, then what happens? After some time, the mind goes the extreme opposite angle, opposite point. You know, the pendulum clock, the pendulum, if it pushes in one direction, then with equal force, it moves in the opposite direction. When the mind moves in the opposite direction, there is a great harm and danger. That's why sometimes those who take a lot of interest in spiritual life in their early years suddenly lose all interest and they become non-believers and they become nihilists. That's why Lord Krishna says we should practice moderation. Yukta ahara vikarasya. The idea is stressed, emphasized again and again. One should practice temperance, moderation in eating, also in recreation. That means normally when we want to relax, in the activity involving relaxation also we must practice moderation. Similarly, yukta chetase karmasu, work. Sometimes people feel that work is the greatest thing in life. Work is important, it is unavoidable, it is indispensable, and again, without work we cannot live in this world, even physically. People have to make both ends meet. They need a job, they need efficiency, they need all the things that are necessary for sustaining life in this world. But at the same time, if we look upon work itself as the one and the only supreme goal in life and put all our energy into work, that at some point, when we get blows, when we face a setback in life, an unexpected setback, then it will shatter our mind. We won't be able to restrain ourselves, we won't be able to absorb the shock. So that's why Lord Krishna says, extreme obsession with work is as bad as laziness or lethargy. Both are equally to be avoided. Laziness or lethargy will be a great obstacle for anyone to make progress in his life or her life. But so work is important. But an extreme obsession with work, that also can lead to serious problems. Frequently we read in newspapers that countries which are well known for a very high level of work ethic, professionalism, what you call perfectionism, not enforced perfectionism or professionalism that you find in dictatorship countries where dictatorial systems, but there are countries in the world where people are naturally efficient, voluntarily hardworking, putting up their best effort for their country's progress. They are role models in many ways, very punctual, very hardworking, very loyal to their company and countries. But then the point is, in such countries sometimes you find retired people becoming depressed, because when they become too old, they cannot do any work. So obsession with work itself can be a problem at that stage. So that's why Lord Krishna says, Yukta ahara viharasya yukta cheshtasya karmasu. We should practice temperance and moderation in work also, in eating food and also in recreation. So also in sleep. Long hours of sleep, excessive sleep can create lethargy and laziness, and not sleeping at all can also create psychological problems and also physical problems, and that could create more obstacles in our spiritual life. There are many obstacles in spiritual life which can be avoided if we practice moderation. And if we don't take care to practice moderation, many of these avoidable problems will crop up and we will be unnecessarily caught in trouble in spiritual life. That's why the point is yogo bhavati dukkha. Mean the one who is practicing moderation, temperance, self-restraint, not going to excesses in all these areas or human activity, like eating food, in sleeping, in remaining awake, in professional work, with those who are practicing moderation, for them yoga becomes a blessing, yoga becomes a solution, yoga becomes a path to spiritual self-discovery. That is the idea behind here. Such persons will be able to sustain their spiritual practices for a long time. As I mentioned earlier, Dirghakala, Nairantarya. These two terms are important. It's from Patanjali. For a long time you should practice, and you should practice without a break. And you should be able to practice with a sense of reverence and respect, satkara. Now, you can practice for a long time and without a break only if you don't feel any strain. Spiritual practice should bring in a feeling of blessedness, effortlessness, inner joy, what you call contentment. If a person becomes unhappy and he says he's praying every day, actually he's insulting God. If somebody tells you, I believe in God, I pray every day, I do a lot of spiritual disciplines, but I'm unhappy, then there's something wrong with that person. A spirit devotee should be essentially living in a state of perpetual contentment and blissfulness, blessedness. That's why Lord Krishna says the 12th chapter, Sandushta Sadadam Yogi Yatatma Dridanischeka Mayarpita Mano Buddhir Yoman Bhakta Same Priyaka. Who is my dearest devotee? The one who has given his heart to me. And the first qualification, the first indication that is a real devotee of God is Santushtaka. He feels this inner effortlessness, total freedom from any strain, any pain, any feeling of exhaustion. So, that is one unique quality. It doesn't mean that spiritual life is always a bed of roses. It's not a cakewalk. It has its own challenges, its own problems. But there are problems when we look at them from their perspective. From the standpoint of the devotee, it is not a problem. Maybe those of you who read Patanjali's Yoga Sutras or Gita, or maybe Chandilya Bhakti Sutras, Narada Bhakti Sutras. Perhaps you may read also the autobiographical writings of somebody like Centuries of Avila, you find. So they had to face problems. Many of the Christian mystics, they had to face problems. They were persecuted, they were excommunicated from the monasteries, and they were sometimes accused of sorcery, so to speak. Many of the mystics had to face a lot of persecutions. We call it persecution, but for them, they were able to withstand these obstacles, these problems with a strength of mind, with a great resourcefulness, because in their hearts, even while facing problems, they were enjoying this inner contentment. Maybe the greatest example can be found in the Bhagavad Purana. Prahlada, little boy. Prahladaschasmi daityanam, in the Gita, Lord Krishna says, among daityas, I am Prahlada. Daityas are those who are not endowed with spiritual qualities, but Prahlada was born in that lineage. His own father was not a devotee, but Prahlada himself became the greatest devotee of all times. Even as a child of 5 years, he was feeling the presence of God every moment in his life, every word he spoke with a prayerful attitude. Every moment he lived in close proximity with God, in God's presence. And we are talking about a small little boy who was a devotee even at birth. Now he had to face a lot of problems, mostly from his own father, who didn't like this little boy's devotion to Lord Mahavishnu. So the Bhagavad Purana is full of graphic descriptions of what all trials and tribulations the little child devotee had to go through, had to undergo. But he stood steadfast. And some of the greatest sayings in the Bhagavad Purana came from this little boy devotee, Prahlada. So you find in the life of great spiritual persons, they always felt, even when they practiced spiritual disciplines, they felt this inner blissfulness and inner blessedness, total freedom from strain and effort. They enjoyed living the life of a devotee. They enjoyed being a devotee of God. So that's why Lord Krishna makes an important point here. Yuktahara viharasya, yukta chetasya karmasu, yukta supnavabodhasya, yogo bhavati dukkha. Yada viniyadam chittam atmannevavatishtade nispraha sarvakamebhyo yukta ityuchyade tada. That is the 18th verse of the 6th chapter. When a devotee is able to completely control his mind rests in Atman alone, in God alone, then he becomes totally free from all other desires. He becomes established in the presence of the Lord within his own heart. And this is called yoga. This particular verse demonstrates how yoga is so the elimination of yoga when the mind dwells on Atman, on God alone. When the mind is completely withdrawn from everything else. It is focused on the presence of the Lord within one's own heart. Sometimes this is called samadhi in some other traditions. When this happens, all the undercurrents the normal emotions and feelings in our mind get a spiritual promotion, they get sublimated. So Sri Ramakrishna in his Gospel explains this state of mind. When a devotee feels every moment of his life, when he feels the presence of the Lord within him, when he is absorbed and focused completely on that divine reality present in his own heart, then he is totally free from all strains, all his feelings, emotions and impressions get spiritually sanctified. So Sri Ramakrishna says, when a boat passes by a magnetic hill, its screws and nails become loose and drop out. So God's presence is like a hill made of magnets. And if a ship which has many nuts and bolts made of iron passes through that hill, what happens? The magnetic pull, it loosens all the nails and screws. Lust and anger and other passions in the mind cannot exist after the vision of God. Once a thunderbolt struck the Kali temple. Sri Ramakrishna is narrating an incident that he himself witnessed in the Dakshineswar temple. Once a thunderbolt struck the Kali temple, I noticed that it loosens all the joints of the screws. It's no longer possible for a man who has seen God to beget children and perpetuate creation. When a grain of paddy is sown, it grows into a plant, but a grain of boiled paddy doesn't germinate. He who has seen God retained his eye only in name. No evil can be done by that. It's a mere appearance like the mark left on the coconut tree by its leaf. Only the mark remains. An example, Dagdha Bija Nyaya. So what happens when a person gets established in this yoga? The vision of God. All his natural impulses and feelings get a spiritual color, get purified by his devotion. So the impact of his spiritual experience on his own feelings and emotions can be seen here. So he may still retain some of his old samskaras, but those samskaras will be like a seed that is cooked and sown in a fertile field, fertile land. It doesn't germinate. But a seed that is fresh, not cooked but fresh, if you sow the seed in a fertile land, it sprouts and becomes a plant and a tree eventually. But the same seed, when it is fried or cooked, and then you throw on soil, it doesn't become a plant. Similarly, when our emotions and feelings, our impulses are natural, even biological impulses, when they are purified and sublimated and sanctified by spiritual practices, then they don't do any harm. That stage of purification or sanctification of our natural impulses is called yoga. That's why yoga is called a destroyer of all miseries. Yoga here should be taken as spiritual life, as experiencing the presence of God within our heart. That's a real implication of the word yoga. That should be understood. That should be emphasized. Thank you. Namaskar. Om Shanti 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 Harihi Om Tat Sat Sri Ramakrishna Arpanamastu.